IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and today we have with ourselves the research team from the Indo-Pacific Studies program at the Takshashila Institution, my colleagues Anushka Saxena, Kingshuk, Saha, and Amit, Kumar. And what we're going to talk about is the upcoming BRICS Summit in Johannesburg, South Africa. This is an interesting moment for this summit to take place. There's been lots of controversy around the attendance of key participants. The BRICS obviously comprises of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And there's been lots of talk around whether this is a geopolitically significant summit. Of course, a lot of the controversy has been around the absence now of Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, who was initially supposed to attend the summit, but complications owing to an ICC order has made it difficult for him to attend. So we'll try to unpack all of this and also think about whether the BRICS even means anything in the world today. And if it does, what does it mean and what are its implications from an Indian interest perspective? So firstly, welcome folks, welcome to this conversation. I'm going to go one by one to each of you with a very simple question, beginning with Anushka. Is the BRICS of any significance today? And if so, what significance is it?
Right. Thanks, Manoj. Firstly, happy to be here. I think just to begin on a more pessimistic than optimistic note, the BRICS has indeed have had many failure points in the past. So, for example, if we look at its new development bank, we see that as opposed to other multilateral economic institutions like the World Bank, they haven't really done intensive development fund contribution, only 33 billion since it was formed or so. Then there are internal challenges that each of the BRICS members faces. For example, countries like South Africa feel that BRICS sometimes pits it against the United States because of proximity to Russia and China. And of course, BRICS has also run roughshod over this trilateral that we know as India, Brazil, and South Africa, which has indefinitely postponed its meetings since 2013. So it's been 10 years. And so that also casts aspersions as to our understanding of BRICS as the voice of the global South. But why I think BRICS is still significant, and I do think it's still significant, is because despite of all of these factors, it's still standing, and all of its member countries' leaders still talk and still use this as a platform to discuss, and haven't missed a single head of countries meetings in any of the BRICS summits so far. And this also makes this upcoming BRICS summit so significant, is because it's the first time that such a meeting is being missed by one of the member countries' leaders. In some years, BRICS has had over 100 meetings between ministers, legislatures, think tanks, academic institutions, and so on and so forth. And so it is indeed one of the very few places where a lot of developmental talk can happen. And it has definitely contributed to India's image as a leading economy of the developing world. So for us, from our perspective too, it's essential to be part of this. In all essence, BRICS also has a flat hierarchy. So that means each country's interests will be taken into account on matters such as climate change, infrastructure investment, or even all the talk that is going on regarding expansion of BRICS, which is likely to be discussed in the upcoming summit. And so there has been a lot of controversy also surrounding whether or not this expansion is valid, whether or not China is promoting it so that it can create a lobby of its own in the global South. But again, I think that power that other members hold over this decision equally as much as China, despite whatever informal hierarchy may be perceived in the organization, is important. So I think these are a few factors that contribute to the significance of the BRICS and in specific to the upcoming summit.
Okay, that was quite comprehensive. So your argument is that basically, in terms of its tangible achievements and outcomes, it has probably not done as much as one would have expected it to have achieved. Yet it's a useful platform. It has reputational gains for India. And of course, because of the nature and the structure of the platform, that it's flat, there is significant bargaining power that India has, along with other members, of course, because their concerns on certain issues have to be taken into account, particularly, say, around expansion, climate change, things like that. Amit, I wanted to turn to you. Do you agree with that assessment, or are you more pessimistic or more optimistic?
First, you will have to qualify the question significant to whom, right? India, to the BRIC members, or the Western countries. But yeah, in general, if you ask me, I mean, yeah, Anushka summed it up pretty well. That the idea was, when it was conceived, it was believed that these countries would emerge as economic force to reckon with, and that the West should integrate them into the international liberal economic order. But if I may say, only China and to an extent India have met the expectations. Russia, Brazil haven't performed on the expected lines, and inclusion of South Africa has only dragged the cumulative growth of the program, right? And somewhat, I mean, the idea was that it would be a group of emerging economies, somewhat rivaling the G7. But the cumulative size of BRICS economy is around, at this point, is $27 billion, of which more than two-thirds, that is $19 trillion, is contributed by China. True. So, I mean, there are discrepancies in how what was expected and what it has, what eventual outcome has turned out to be. Until date, as Anushka said, BRICS had only, I mean, according to me, it had only one claim to success, that was the establishment of NDB. But in 7 to 8 years, it has only contributed $33 billion of committed to $33 billion of project, and compare it to the World Bank, like the last fiscal year itself, it gave out more than $110 billion to the developing countries. So and besides that, there is an issue of disagreement, given that India-China rivalry is always reflected. The summit has turned out to be, I mean, in my sense, just another platform where joint statements are read. And so, yeah, there are, I mean, besides that, I still think there's merit for India to be associated with BRICS, because who knows, if India withdraws, Beijing would have it its way and might, end up integrating GCI, GSI, GDI, all with the BRICS. And yeah. So there's merit in India. Just despite all the problems, I think there's merit for India to be associated with BRICS, so that it does not leave the platform to China.
Okay, interesting. So, yes, there is relevance for India to participate, partly because of the nature of its competition with China, but it's not necessarily yielded the kind of dividends that one would have expected. And as a grouping also, these economies, I mean, today, like you said, right, China contributes about 18 to 19 trillion of the entire BRICS pool in terms of GDP value. And at the same time, Russia today is in some ways a sinking economy, unless, of course, things turn around politically and in terms of the war in Ukraine. So there are more challenges in that sense, and the asymmetry within the group is quite sort of evident. Kingshuk, I know that you have a slightly more optimistic view of the BRICS. I wanted to get your take on what exactly your view is on the significance of the grouping, and just some thoughts on the arguments that Anushka and Amit have put forward. Amit is obviously far more pessimistic in his view, particularly from an Indian perspective. I wanted to get your thoughts.
I think it should be rather than optimistic or pessimistic view, one can have a more pragmatic view. Like, I agree with most of the argument Amit and Anushka made, but one thing we have to see, the BRIC as a concept was not an organic concept that these countries had come up with. It was more like come out of a research paper by a Goldman Sachs economist in 2001. It was followed by in 2013 by two other economists of that organization, Dominic Wilson and Rupa Purushottam, like Dreaming with BRICS, the part to 2050. But if you look at their main contention was these countries will be an economic power to reckon with. As Amit has rightly pointed out, and these countries that are developing will compete as an economic power with the West and have a greater say in the world. But if you look at from 2013 onward, Brazil, Russia, South Africa had less than 1% of growth. And it looks very prima facie. If you see a BRIC as an organization, they represent 40% of global population, 20% of global GDP, and around 17% of global trade, all those. But the lion's share is mostly by China and followed by India. Rest of the members are way down. Another contention of BRIC was that BRIC would emerge as a voice of global South. But even that can be contested, like who is global South and who represent. If you look at the organization of these five countries, China and Russia are autocratic, while India, Brazil, and South Africa, despite their shortcomings, are democratic countries. So when they want to pitch itself as a voice against the West, but within this group there is the inherent contradiction as it is unfolding, like with China wanting to expand, as it is having increasingly more issues with the West led by US. Russia has joined the bandwagon with China for the simple reason post Ukraine war it is getting increasingly isolated. It wants a platform where it can be heard and it can put forth its voice. For Brazil and South Africa, it's more like they want to be the only representative in BRIC from their respective continent. For India, it is far more complicated because like if more members are added, the question is not only being more members added, but what is the criteria? There is no defined criteria. So like, is it first come served basis or is the country with whom your relation is good? These are the
we'll come to the discussion on expansion further, but essentially your view is that yes, it's a much more complicated picture, right? I mean, in terms of there's the internal structure of the BRICS and just the identity that it currently has. I'll come to the expansion specifically, and I want to get everybody's thoughts on the expansion conversation. But before I get to that, I wanted to sort of, since none of you are really very optimistic, let me identify some more achievements of the BRICS. It's not just the NDB, it's also the Contingency Reserve Fund, which is $100 billion, which is really useful, particularly as, things become much more difficult financially for other countries. Then, of course, you've got, the one big success in my view was the lobbying that was done early, in 2010 when you ended up with IMF quota reforms, so that was significant as an achievement. But again, that came at a heady point of time when, there was this appreciation of these, I think it's useful to locate oneself at that point of time, right? This is 2008, 2009, when the world had just gone through a financial crisis. The West was particularly badly hit. And, the world was, across Europe, there was a sense of doom and gloom because of austerity measures, banking collapse, whereas the emerging market economies looked far more strong and stable and resilient. I think in that moment, there was obviously a certain opportunity, which has shifted today. Of course, like Anushka, I think also pointed out that, the ability to jointly articulate positions and like Kingshuk said, of such a large set of humanity. And of course, $27 trillion is still quite a bit, right? So to be able to articulate for such a large set of economy, it's significant, right? To be able to come at some sort of common positions. So to that extent, yes, I think it does. There are these successes where you can come to common positions on key issues. But yeah, I want to come to this next bit, which is around, two questions. One is the idea of a common BRICS currency, which is obviously not something that's going to be discussed at this summit, or at least we don't expect an outcome, because the Indian side has quite publicly said that, it's not something that they're working on. But I wanted to get some thoughts on, and very brief thoughts on that idea of common currency, but also the idea of, the relevance of BRICS in the context of geopolitical competition today. Because when BRICS came into being to the world that we're in today, it's starkly different. So I want to begin with first Kingshuk, that, does the group need a new identity? You talked about the group not having an identity, in the past. But does the group need a new identity? And if that identity is a geopolitical identity, which China and Russia are trying to create, which is an anti-Western geopolitical identity, how does that impact India?
Yeah. So China and Russia basically are trying to create new identity for BRICS given their geopolitical compulsion. But the moment they're trying to do this, like it is going against the inherent principle of BRIC for the simple reason, like BRIC was meant to be a grouping for developing countries, not developed countries. So, and they will be caught into the battle between the West and Russia and China in one side. And the countries, they want to be part of BRIC. As of now, they're getting both economic and other technological support from West. They will be deprived of that. Like having said that, for India, like this is critical. India's position has always been driven by India's national interest. So that is that you don't align with any camp, but you go by what is also in this way, it will be highly compromised. India doesn't want to join the China and Russia against the West. And having said that, India is already having a lot of issues with China.
Okay, so it complicates India's position because, like we've already discussed, like even you said and others also said that while India might not want to exit the BRICS because it provides you with a platform, and like Amit said, I think that you don't want to leave that platform to China. At the same time, because if this identity starts to shift, it makes it much more difficult for you to stay in the platform also, right? It makes it uncomfortable for you to stay. Anushka, I wanted to get your thoughts on this.
Personally, I think the BRICS identity is its catchy acronym, but also the image assigned to it as five of the most important economies of the developing world coming together to discuss issues where in other multilateral institutions they might or might not have been denied that opportunity because of other dominant countries in the world, say the top economies of the G20 or the Western Alliance, so on and so forth. And so the joint need to kind of protect each other in times of crisis, or some of the BRICS members seek permanent membership to the United Nations Security Council. So some of these joint endeavors that stem from that image of not having a voice in the global order or in the multilateral institutions, I think that's what forms the core of the BRICS identity. And all the conversations say related to the common currency or to a development fund that focuses solely on the member countries' infrastructure projects, as well as infrastructure projects and developmental projects of other such developing countries like Bangladesh, which have also been included in the new development bank plan, kind of adds to the this narrative and this image of the BRICS. And I personally don't think that there is a shift per se in this identity. I think there is still a lot of nostalgia and value attached to countries being associated with that same image. But like I said before, the discussions on expansion and actual expansion of the BRICS might likely change that, and then might warrant a discussion on whether or not the previous countries want to stay in or not. So
I'm curious how you said that the identity has not been, there's no attempt to shift the identity, right? I remember writing a piece last year after the BRICS Summit in which I'd argued that, if you read through the speeches of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin delivered at last year's summit and the speeches of then President Bolsonaro, Prime Minister Modi and Cyril Ramaphosa, what you will come away with is that the rest of them were, yes, they were concerned about geopolitics, but their primary concern was around the downstream effects of competition and conflict. But it was China and Russia who were basically arguing BRICS needs to become a bulwark against hegemonism, protectionism, power politics of the West, and so on and so forth. So there is obviously, yes, I agree, this common sense of wanting to have a greater voice in global governance. But there's obviously a shift in terms of the sharpness of it becoming a politically far more salient body in terms of the competition with the West, in terms of China's competition with the West, as opposed to necessarily just what was previously seen, right? That we want, yes, we are major economies, our clout comes from our economic growth, and we want greater say in global governance because, hey, we deserve it, look at our size, look at our economic contributions to the global GDP and so on and so forth. So don't you think that there is a change that's happening, Anushka?
To that, what comes to mind is that even though China and Russia have been sharper in their articulation of how much say or they want in kind of global governance and how much more important their say has become in global governance, and the other three member countries like India, Brazil and South Africa may not have articulated that way, I think the sentiment is felt likewise across these three countries as well. For example, just because India says, and we talked about this a while ago, that we want strategic autonomy and, there's no camp system, there's nothing of the sort, we still see that India has wanted to maintain its bets on Russia against pressure from the US and at the same time expand its partnership with the US. And we see South Africa doing that as well, right? South Africa faced a lot of pressure and, it supported Russia with, say, military exercises in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, but at the same time, it has sought to expand its trade with the United States. So the sentiment is still that each of the countries are their own entities, deserve a voice in global governance, whether or not they articulate it more aggressively or not.
Okay, Amit, tell me you disagree with that.
Yes, I clearly think that this there has been a shift in how the identity is being perceived by BRICS members, especially Russia and China. The idea of anti-Western identity has largely come up because of two reasons. The fact that the BRICS itself has not been able to live up to the expectations on the economic front. And second, the internal problems or the external problems, foreign policy problems that both the two leading geopolitical actors, China and Russia, have with the West. So their external problems with the West, Russia is engaged in war in Ukraine. China has not had a good relationship with the US for the past 2-3 years. And there's increasing animosity between these two countries on one side and the West and the US on the other. And this is why I think there has been a greater push to achieve, lately, to attain a geopolitical identity and somewhat of diversion. And this currency, new BRICS current local currency, I think is a subset of this particular idea. I mean, rightly, India has backed out of this and said it's not interested in the local BRICS currency, because if you look at, we need to accept that India is not a major trading economy in this grouping. India has a huge trade deficit with all the members of the grouping except for Brazil, I think. And even with Brazil, we have a very minuscule trade of around $8 billion. So if this idea is allowed to go ahead, I think the BRICS currency will end up becoming a yuan internationalization program, and it's not in our interest, right? And partly the problem, why this idea is being promoted is because Russia is having problems. Its assets have been frozen by the US and in other countries where it holds reserves in US dollar. China has its own internationalization program and perceives a similar threat in case of a conflict breaks out in the cross strait between Taiwan and China. And other countries have had some grievances against the US dollar hegemony because there's rising inflation and they have a problem controlling inflation. Yeah, these are the things, but it wouldn't be in our interest to go ahead with this BRICS currency program.
Okay, it's nice to get these two very divergent viewpoints, on the nature of the structure of the BRICS and its identity and its relevance to India, and of course the challenges that India faces by being in the group. And one of the big challenges that India faces by being in the group is fundamentally around this idea of expansion, which is the last question that I wanted to get to.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Again, wanted brief thoughts from everybody so that we don't go over time. But just briefly, I wanted to come to each of you. Perhaps I can start with Amit. The idea that, the group is going to expand, and it's not clear how. I mean, the fact that the group is going to expand is quite obvious. There is going to be an expansion. It may not happen today or during this summit formally, but it will happen going forward. Does an expansion serve India's interests? Or does it not serve India's interest and it's fine to just keep the group in the way it is? And if an expansion happens, how should India be dealing with it so that its interests sort of are best served? So Amit, let's begin with you.
Yeah. So as Reuters pointed out that there have been more than 44 applications for there's no public list, but as per their reports that there are more than 44 countries who are interested in becoming part of the organization. And I think around 22 of them have filed formal requests. Would it be in India's? At first we have to settle on criteria. So the initial criteria when the BRICS was formed, it was thought that these countries would be the emerging economies of the coming years. But if you look at the applications, the countries in the public domain, what information we have available, there are countries like Kazakhstan, Turkey, Mexico, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, Iran. And not all countries have had that strong economic basis. And what would be the criteria actually which go into in determining which country should join, what are the criteria? Obviously, there are concerns that most of these countries who are trying to make their way into BRICS are the ones who have some sort of turbulence with the West or the US and trying to circumvent that US hegemony or the US dominance in the global affairs and seek a greater bargaining power. Of course, what it would mean to China and India, I think China would be quite interested in expanding the grouping to gain more legitimacy, to gain more voice, to be seen as a legitimate power in the global order. Given the fact that this would be, if this process is supported by China, there would be a problem if how India perceives this expansion of the grouping. Clearly, we do not have an agreement. Most of the issues when it is debated within BRICS, and if we'll also have to think if any structural changes will go into after the expansion of the membership and how the decision is being made and what power how much power does it give to each member or each of the original members, or how much of an influence does China get from this expansion of members? So these will be things which I'm not sure how it will affect India. But I think I clearly think that it is something that China wants, and we need to wait and watch how this thing.
From your point of view, India's primary concern is what the expansion does in terms of further exacerbating the asymmetry that is in China's favor within the group and how that impacts India. Kingshuk, your take on expansion. Sorry, I cut you off earlier, but now I wanted to get to your take on expansion.
Firstly, what would be the name after the expansion? Like that would be interesting things to know. Having said that, like apart from Russia and China, like the three other member countries have their reservation for each for their own way. As I have said, like South Africa want to be someone from Africa, Brazil someone want to be Latin America, and for that matter, for India, the concern is far more deeper. Like, would this be taken over by China? Like all these countries, because China is already having a lion's share in BRIC, like all major exporter, and also if these countries, those will be joining BRIC, already they have a deep economic relation. So would that influence their judgment or decision after joining BRIC? So India, like another challenge for India, like as we know, like India won't be able to hold this for long, because in the list, some of India's friend countries, be it Bangladesh and Saudi Arabia, they also aspire to join BRIC for their own reasons. So as Amit has pointed out, yeah, it would be wait and watch. But having said that, like I think Brazil has recommended, like rather than taking a new member, first let us put them as an observer or a partner country. So I think slowly, like that would unfold how it will be.
Okay, so yeah, interesting, right? Perhaps they would think of some sort of an acronym, particularly if Russia and China get their way. I don't know. I was trying to come up with something around wall, because BRICS eventually form a wall, but I couldn't come up with something meaningful. Anushka, perhaps you can, you can give us an interesting acronym for the future of the BRICS. But yeah, your take on enlargement and expansion and its impact from an Indian interest perspective. Also, I want you to think and tell us a little bit about why do countries want to join the BRICS?
So I'll tell you what I wouldn't want the acronym to be, which is BALL or NAM 2.0. But I think on the expansion, it's really interesting because not only has the debate on expansion of members been happening for a long time, it's also been that a lot of currently existing mechanisms and features of the BRICS kind of support it, right? So adding on to what you said, Manoj, about it's absolutely going to happen, not in this, no decision in this summit, but maybe in the future. For example, we see since 2017, there is already a BRICS Plus mechanism. And under that BRICS Plus mechanism, there is an interbank cooperation mechanism. And what that does is that it allows countries within BRICS and with countries that are part of BRICS Plus to have bank-to-bank or trade relations that are conducted in the individual currencies of the bilateral partners. And the debate about BRICS expansion then is also supported by the fact that NDB already has external members like Bangladesh, Egypt, UAE, and even 30% of their loans are serviced in their domestic currencies and not in the US dollar, and so on and so forth, right? So there is a strong endeavor to trade in local currencies already in the BRICS mechanisms, and there are already new members or countries engaging with it apart from the five primary members for the past 5 to 7 years. But at the same time, there exist challenges for each of the member states. Before I come to India, for example, I think South Africa has a big contention to it, which is not just that African countries be involved in it and that would be their preference, as Kingshuk pointed out, but also let's assume that countries that are, say, on the who've opted to be part of BRICS, for example, Mexico, Argentina, all of them have publicly put in requests to be part of the BRICS. So that's some countries that we know about. They all have economies bigger than South Africa's $400 billion output, right? So that would make South Africa question whether or not these countries displace its power in this organization and kind of lead to reduction in its influence. At the same time, as others pointed out, and I won't take much time on this, India's challenges are mostly with the countries that kind of come in through China's proposals, and how India would find a way to circumvent some of the problems it may see with the members China proposes, and how they can benefit India in the long term, their inclusion or their exclusion from BRICS. As to why countries might want to become member states of BRICS, that's definitely a tough one. I think it has to do again with what I said about the image associated with BRICS, that it's, some of the important economies of the developing world that need a voice in global governance. And of course, that brings with itself a certain prestige. And I think the members in BRICS also recognize that, some of them at least. For example, when we see Brazil kind of opposing the idea of expansion or saying that we should be cautious about about it. We saw that Brazilian Foreign Minister Vieira said that BRICS is a brand and an asset. And so we have to take care of it because it means and represents a lot. So if that's the perception of the members who've been in the organization for a while now, imagine what external members would look at it as, right? So it makes the idea of expansion both difficult for members who are in it and very appealing to the members or the countries that are outside it. And of course, for the issues that kind of hegemony, or not hegemony, but the preeminence of the dollar may have created for some of the smaller countries in the aftermath of the Russia-Ukraine war, they also might want to find some respite in the fact that BRICS has a lot of mechanisms that deals with local currencies. So everything from green climate financing to developmental and infrastructure loans by the NDB, they have a 30% domestic currency loan component. So I think that might also be an appealing economic option. And so these countries might not want to go to China necessarily, but can use the inter-BRICS mechanisms to achieve that. So that's just my thoughts on why it might be appealing for other countries.
Yeah, essentially, I mean, access to capital, and like you rightly pointed out, I think and it's an interesting point, right? The idea of being associated with a brand that is seen as success, and a brand which was coined because it was seen as a success, as opposed to anything like inorganically coined because these countries were seen as successes. But a brand which is now undergoing, Anushka, you don't agree, but Amit and I agree, at least, and I think even Kingshuk agrees, that to a certain extent, the brand which is going through a rebranding exercise led by China and Russia, would then it be still as appetizing for countries outside? I mean, perhaps still, because the economic incentives might be there for them to be partners. But then, of course, how that impacts countries that are already members of the BRICS. Because if you have 10 new countries that are seeking, say, funding from the NDB, or that have that stake a claim on the contingency reserve fund, that just means lesser amount of money for existing countries within the BRICS mechanism, right? It's the same pool, unless those countries are bringing in new monies, which perhaps they will, perhaps they won't, I don't know. But again, that depends on, are you placing any criteria for expansion, or is it political preferences? So yeah, interesting and difficult sort of thing to sort out. The last point that I want to leave everyone with is, as much as we're talking about, local currency trade and BRICS facilitating local currency trade, it's quite striking that ever since the war in Ukraine began, India and Russia have struggled to come up with a rupee-ruble trade mechanism. At the same time, India and China trade is predominantly in dollars. Although India has used the yuan to pay for some energy payments, Russian energy payments, but it's not necessarily that even within the BRICS countries, they are trading in local currencies. For example, I think our trade deficit with China currently for this half of the year is around $47-50 billion. I wonder what will China do with $50 billion worth of rupees. So it's not as straightforward. Ambition might be there to diversify, but it's much more tricky to get there. I want to thank everyone for your thoughts on this really interesting summit that's coming up next. And I'm happy that we disagree on lots of things, which always shows that that there is divergence of views, and we get to learn from each other and have, rather than everybody nodding and saying that we agree with each other. So it's really good to have different perspectives as part of this conversation. So once again, thank you, Amit. Thank you, Anushka. Thank you, Kingshuk. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I hope that our listeners have also enjoyed this.
Thanks, Manoj.
Thank you, Manoj. Thank you for having us.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.